The Rational Male, Chapter 4, The Security and Development Phase. Before I move on in this study, I am going to take a moment to once again clarify the purpose of this timeline. It is important to remember that this chronology is meant to serve as a general direction for women maturation and the priorities of attraction they put on men attributes during these phases of their lives. By design, this graph isn't intended to be a specific outline to account for every woman's individual circumstances, but a somewhat predictive series of phase coordinated with events, behaviors, and mental schema that occur during those phases. This perspective I have approached in this outline is one of the unattached long-term single or semi-monogamous woman with the personal and the social options to leverage her sexual agency as well as subjective degree of control over the direction of her life, or the strong impression that she actually has in control. Of course, I'll be remiss to assume all women individual circumstances will follow the same series of instances subject to the same set of circumstances. In any one woman's life, there are far too many subjective eventualities to consider that would fit into the scope of this book, which is why I have detailed these phases in a general terms as I can fashion them. To the point though, it is up to any one man to determine how the woman's personal condition, her past decision, and the consequences of her past discretion or indiscretion contribute to what is motivating her along this general outline of life phases. It is entirely possible, if not likely, a woman would have a prior marriage or a single mother during any of all the phases I have detailed. It is also not unlikely a woman might be a serial monogamist or married during the duration of her party years. The art of determining what motivates a woman according to the phases of this life she is in, her socialization, her self-circumstances are modified by it is what a PUA represent artistry. The important part of determining what motivates women's behaviors and mindset is to frame these personal circumstances against this outline of women's life phases. In general, the phases and the progression of maturity, socially, personally, and biologically. Her prioritization of the attractive male attributes and the resulting purpose-driven behaviors don't change much for women as a whole. What changes is the context an individual woman finds them attractive in. It is when you consider how an attractive woman's circumstances work within or against this progression, and how you as a man can first determine if the womb is worth varying degree of your investment, that you may better leverage what you know about her condition and the phase of lives she is experiencing to your own or your mutual benefit. I frame individual observation and understanding of specific topics as they relate to both women's stages of life and their circumstances. This has been a part of my writing process since I began making forum posts years ago. But in real life, in the moment, you need to have a basic grasp of who you're dealing with and what motivates her according to the priorities she places on men and herself in any phase of life, as well as considering the social influences she is being subjected to. Who cares? Right now, all this probably seems like a lot of effort and a lot of hassle. Quote, why the hell even, Rollo? If I had to untangle a chick's psyche and socialization every time I want a new piece of ass, I'll just be a monk. End of quote. In truth, on various levels of consciousness, you already make most of this assessment about a woman when you invest any degree of effort, game in her, even if it's to get laid. You may not realize you're doing it. Your investment in a woman in itself modified by your own conditioning, your deficiencies and strengths, but rest assured, you are making this assessment on some level of consciousness. The difference now is that you have to outline to be better aware of the framework you are making this assessment in. That's a cornerstone of red pill truth. Understanding what motivates a woman at any phase of her maturation isn't terribly difficult to grasp. Once you yourself has experienced that phase in a woman, and that's the intent of my developing this outline, to help younger men without the benefit of this prior, sometimes detrimental experiences make informed assessment about the motivation of women they may be interested in at various stages of their maturity. Equally important is an understanding of how the social convention and the rationales of female-centric society endorses and propagates for women factors to their own ideologies, as well as to how they absorb women's already sopilistic nature from the personal accountability as she matures. Furthermore, what also important is the understanding of the guilt and the regret that result from not having lived up to the expectation these social conventions convince women they should be entitled to have experienced by a certain development phase. Women tend to be both perpetrators and later the victim of the same conventions by design. With the rise of instant communication, only recently have men begun to connect the dots with regards to how these social conventions have been established to correlate with the decisions women make for themselves and the fluidity with which these conventions allow them to rationalize the outcomes of these decisions. Hypergamy has always been an impulse for women, but until the sexual revelation of women from the societal and the ideological balances that previous kept hypergamy in check, there was less need for many social conventions now necessary to balance women's accountability, psychologically and sociologically, in that new freedom. The security phase. Women's priorities for attraction, not necessarily arousal, are dependent upon the necessities dedicated by which phase of life she is currently in. On occasion, I tagged men's peak sexual market value at around 36 to 38 in partially due to their relative capacity for attracting the characteristics and accomplishment that women first find most desirable for long-term commitment, and at about the same time women are most necessitous of these qualities. As women approach the epiphany phase, later the wall, and realize the decay of their sexual market value in comparison to younger women, they become progressively more incentivized towards attraction to the qualities of man possesses that will best satisfy the long-term security of better bags, sides of her hypergamy demands. For many women, this realization is their first experience with the dread that comes from a new uncertainty of attracting and retaining a man in monogamy. Too many blue-pilled apologists dismiss the sexual market value realities by graph depicts by comparing the party year's desire to any SMV picked 23-year-old girl with the vested value of that 7-year-old SMV picked man represent to a woman overall long-term dualistic need hypergamy. What maximizes the sexual market value of a woman in her peak is not equal to what maximizes the sexual value peak of a man. During what I term the security phase, woman prioritization attraction shift to the man's potential for positioning. While the newfound attraction to intrinsic qualities of a man are overtly exaggerated as appealing to women during this phase, it is essentially a man's proven capacity to provide enough resources for himself and a potential mate and future family that they key to this attraction. These are qualities an SMV picked man is socially expected to possess and socially expected to deliver for a woman precisely at the time in which she finds herself the most necessitous of these qualities and provisioning, 29 to 31 years of age. It is during the security phase women begin to alter their self-expectation as well as to overtrip beyond their frustration about their own inability to secure commitment from what they now perceive would be a socially equitable mate. The social conventions already in place for women in this phase make them comfortable in attempting to shame men into compliance with their long-term security need. This is the phase you'll most likely hear a woman complaining about men's fragile egos, men being threatened by strong independent women, or some other frustration about men not cooperating with the social script of their rapidly decaying dualistic sexual strategy. Settling. Security, anxiety, and the conflict a woman experiences with her sexual market value decay forces two outcomes for her. She can convince herself to believe her sexual market value is still comparative to her intersexual competitors, or she can settle on a hypergamously substandard man who gratefully embodied what the provisioning aspect of her hypergamy demands. If she's followed the alpha fax schedule during her party years, it is also possible she finds herself as a single mother seeking a provider to assist in the parental investment her alpha gene provider wasn't, or is limited part of. I should mention that transition and security phases are a point at which most men, betas, feminized conditions comes to fruition for the feminine imperative. The beta providers who have been patiently waiting their moment of sexual validation find their moment of peak attraction, and not uncommonly with the same women or types of women who had no use for them during their party years. The well-conditioned beta is nothing not patient and dutiful in his feminine primary purpose, and it is this phase he begins to see dividends of his steadfastness in supporting the feminine cause. His willingness to forgive a woman party years in discretion, he believes, will be an investment in a rational equity and equality women will appreciate. It is important to understand that the social engineering of feminine imperative conditions better men to be predisposed to this white knight mentality are precisely the same women will need this provisioning the most. The stage in which the sexual market value declines and begins its ascendancy as defined by her need. During the security phase, affluence, provisioning capacity, and the status that should be associated with it become a primary attractor for women. The want for physical appeal and arousal cues are still an important factor in attraction, but indicators of maturity, affluence, and other intrinsic qualities become a priority. That isn't to say a random short-term mating opportunity with an arousing alpha would be ignored, especially around her ovulation cycle, but long-term security takes precedence. Women who consolidate a monogamous commitment during this phase or in their epiphany phase generally run through a series of mental self-rationalization over their decisions to marry the good dad rather than the good genes father. This is an effort women engage in to justify to their conditioning on the security side of their hypergamous sexual strategy. Once children are part of her reality, this mental subaltern has to be forced to the periphery of her attentions. But it is in the psychological conflict she is either going to resolve by eventually leaving her provider male and seek out alpha window substitute, or convince herself her hypergamous conscience that she has in fact optimized her hypergamy with the male she settled on. As a woman matures into her late security phase and her children become more self-sufficient, it is at this point she becomes more self-critical and retrospective of her epiphany phase, and more realistic about her true reasoning for experiencing it. The development phase. Because a woman's capacity to attract her hypergamous ideal decays with every passing year, her agency demands an immediacy with a man, embodying as close to that ideal as possible in the now. Hypergamy takes a big risk in betting on a man's future potential to become or get close to becoming her hypergamous ideal, so the preference leans towards seeking out man in most established than the next. The problem with this scenario, as you might guess, is that women's SMV depreciates as men appreciate, or at least should appreciate. The same hypergamy that constantly tests and doubts the fitness of a man is seeking its security also limits his potential to constantly satisfy it. From the security phase into the development phase is generally the time during which a woman has satisfied the security needs side of her hypergamy with a man who consolidated on a long-term security with during the epiphany transition phase. Before I elaborate further, I should remind men that this particular phase can sometimes precede the epiphany transition phase for women who, by circumstance such as an unplanned pregnancy, personal conviction, pairing with a man she believes has future SMV potential or believes is so far above her own foreseeable SMV, looks, affluence, and status frame that she feels compelled to consolidate on him. This early security phase may also be a result of particularly bad experience a woman in her party years had with a prior alpha lover, the emotional trauma of which convinced her to console herself with an accessible beta orbiter who was potential enough and fortunate enough to be his dutiful, forgiving, and supportive self in the right place at the right time. Most commonly, however, this phase usually occurs within 7 to 9 years window, just after a woman consolidates on or should have consolidated on a long-term security prospect male and this is usually after her transitioning from her party years and dealing with the urgency of finding that prospective male. It is important to delineate the circumstances that affect women who have successfully paired prior to this phase from the women who remain single, never married, or are divorcees. Between the ages of 27 to 37, these circumstances define how a woman engages and copes with her development and redevelopment phase. The 7th inch. For this 7 to 9 year stretch in her early to mid 30s, a married woman will likely content herself in some semblance of what feminine centrism defines of her domesticity. That may likely include working motherhood role, but for the stage of her party years usually becomes something she'd rather not be reminded of, particularly so if she settled on a provider male who doesn't excite her the way her former alpha lovers did, and she gradually tires of this whiny wonderment at why she's not asexual with him, not that they are married with children as she was with those prior alpha lovers. There is a very interesting social convention that accompanies this phase for the married woman. In fact, there was an old movie dedicated to it. It is called The 7-Year Itch. It was a cute movie. It was based on the very psychological phenomena the courtesy social convention revolves around men developing a wandering eye for strange vagina after mysterious being married for 7 magical number years. The reality is that most marriages tend to dissolve at 2 stages, after the 7-year mark and then again at the 20-year mark. Primarily, this is due to the couple having had at least one child, possibly 2, and after that kid reaches 7 and is becoming more autonomous, men and women so do some relationship evaluation. From a tribal evolutionary perspective, this will be a point at which a child is more or less self-sufficient with a minimum investment on the part of the male, but it is contemporary relationship. But in contemporary relationship, it is also at the point in which a woman has had time enough to reevaluate her epiphany phase, decision to pair with a provider, father of her children or otherwise, and compare his accurate SMV to the idealization she still holds about the past alpha lovers or alpha she imagines she will succeed in. Just to complete, the 20-year-old mark is generally the point at which both parents become empty nesters, and the second reevaluation takes place. More on this in part 4. The path to spinsterhood. For women unable or unwilling to settle, compromise or otherwise consolidate for a long-term monogamy, her security phase becomes a personal effort in generating long-term security for herself. This security may come with some help from a generous feminine primary state, or with the help of child support, or alimony from the dissolved marriage, or single pregnancy prior to this phase, or of course she may entirely ignore the dictates of her biological clock, fertility window, and double down on her feminine masculine's condition by conditioning it excessively for herself. Since Loisy so eloquently outlined this woman demography, I'll quote him here. This is the outline of the gaming 31 to 34-year-old unmarried women. 31 to 34-year-olds. In some ways, women in the 31 to 34-year range are the toughest broods to game. By toughest, it is meant most time consuming. It is counterintuitive, yes, but there are factors that work beside her declining beauty that mitigate against the AC. Quickly, for one, it is obviously harder to meet single 31 to 34-year-old women than it is to meet single younger women. Marriage is still a pussy-limiting force to contend with for the invalent womanizer, but cheer to appreciates and hard work are battling the scorching. But cheer to appreciates are hard at work battling the scourge of meeting market disturbances caused by the grinding and the churning of the marriage machine. But the bigger reason 31 to 34-year-olds are harder to game than any other age group of women has to do with the weakened nexus of entitlement and the self-preservation that occurs at this age in women. When you combine a disproportionate sense of entitlement fueled by years of feminism, steady paychecks and promotion, and cheerleading gay boyfriends with a suspicion of every man's motives and a terrible anxiety of being used for sexual freeing son's marriage proposal, you get a venom-spitting malevolent demoness on guard against anything she might perceive as less than the total subjugation of her craving for incessant fraternity and the princess pedestally. I have an easier time bending and dating 23-year-olds than I do with 33-year-olds. This defines all logical until you see it through the eyes of the hamster sweating and the fluffy ass off in the woman's brain. Poor little creature must be pooped at by the mid-30s. Sure, a 33-year-old is not as hot as a 23-year-old version of herself, but the ASD, anti-slut defense, is through the roof, as is her self-conception of a hot marriage-worthy commodity. Many older women will tell themselves that their experience, maturity, accomplishment, and financial stability mean they should be way more valuable to men seeking wives than some younger babe on the take. Of course, they have to tell themselves this because reality isn't making it easy to believe. These are the kind of women who have sexual flings with college guys because they can psychologically box those men in as purely for fun, adventures. But the men the 31 to 34-year-old women really want are the older established men who will give them a marriage proposal and a family. This is why it is counterintuitive harder to game the older woman who still retains a vestige of her youthful attractiveness. She wants and expects so much more than younger woman. Social conventions. During her epiphany phase, the alpha window of the former cock-aroused riding wife-to-be may convince herself that she actually saw the alpha potential or a potential for long-term success in settling in a better in a long term. While I have had men read horror stories about women knowing that they were settling and being insecure about their futures before or at the time of their weddings, I am going to suggest that this foreknowledge is rarely a conscious aspect of women's insights. Turning on their husband to be later in life rarely a preconceived plan, but it is a predictive outcome for men who persist in better mindset throughout their marriages. Social conventions abound for women to rely on, and they become less incentivized to have sex with their better husbands after the first child, body image consideration, mismatched libidos, and well, sex is supposed to taper off marriage. Everyone knows that are just some of the prepackaged tropes ready to use. The turn-in. Once the first or second child arrives, a woman's order or intimate priorities change or turns to that of the child. The sex reward, the cookie time for good boy, for desired behavior or performance, turns off, or sex is used as an intimate reward for desired behavior, doing domestic chores, etc. She becomes a utility, a positive reinforcer for the better increasing of his provisioning capacity rather than the true visceral enjoyment she had with her past lovers or possibly the younger version of her husband. This new functionality that sex represents to a wife becomes a turning on the husband who believed he would always be her most intimate priority. In the instance of a woman marrying her alpha provider, this may in fact be the case, but the alpha doesn't have the same concern with it and didn't marry his wife under the same pre-expectation a beta does. For the man who persists in his beta mindset, or the guy who regresses into the mindset, this turning becomes more and more pronounced. The turning comes out of the bedroom and into the other matters of their relationship. Finances, familial ties, her expectation of his ambitiousness, his asserting himself at work or with their mutual friends, or more and more fonts he is compared to other men and the ghost of the alpha she knows and has known. Even though the beta is aware his children are now his wife's true purity, his blue pill conditioning still predisposes him to sacrifices. Again, he meets with ready-made social convention that shame his discontent. Is sex all that is important to you? It shouldn't be, because it is really what it is on the inside that counts. But she can't shake the feeling he is slipping out of her respect. This is when the better dad doubles down. His brutal expectation of himself requires an all-consuming self-sacrificing disposition. The horse will work harder. His wife may have had lost respect for him by this point, but his sense of honor and duty presses him on. He doesn't want to be like his own oppressive or non-present father was. He wants to outsupport his father's goals, or what he believes other guys would do with their marriages get tough. So he waits it out, but she is turned on him by this point. It wasn't planned, but all this is martyr-like determination only makes her that much more resentful for having settled on this better. After a certain stressing point, her disinterest or indignation goes even beyond his capacity to stay committed to a losing investment. These are the guys who tell me, "Damn, Rollo, where were you when I was 30? I wish I'd known then what I know now." Do all marriages and relationships follow this schedule? No, but it is important that men know the signs, understand what is really expected of them, and know when they are being settled on despite on all the woman's self-interested reflection on that. It is important they realize that performance isn't limited on how well they meet a woman's expectations, but that performance means ignoring those preconceptions and exceeding them because he has a passion to excel on his own and for himself. It is important that he lives in his own frame and that any woman, wife or otherwise, participates in his frame at his pleasure. Better men rarely have those expectations because they begin from a position of scarcity and a preconditioned responsibility to forgive a woman's sexual strategy while still gushingly appreciative that she chose him to settle on. He was told he doesn't deserve a great girl like her and he still believes in it. End of chapter 4.